The building sector accounts for 23% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. 141 About half of the energy is used for space and water heating. 190 Building insulation can reduce the primary energy demand significantly. Heat pump loads may also provide a flexible resource that can participate in demand response to integrate variable renewable resources into the grid. 191 Solar water heating uses thermal energy directly. Sufficiency measures include moving to smaller houses when the needs of households change, mixed use of spaces and the collective use of devices. 71 Planners and civil engineers can construct new buildings using passive solar building design, low-energy building, or zero-energy building techniques. In addition, it is possible to design buildings that are more energy efficient to cool by using lighter-colored, more reflective materials in the development of urban areas. Heat pumps efficiently heat buildings, and cool them by air conditioning. A modern heat pump typically transports around 3 to 5 times more thermal energy than electrical energy consumed. The amount depends on the coefficient of performance and the outside temperature. 192. Refrigeration and air conditioning account for about 10% of global CO2 emissions caused by fossil fuel-based energy production and the use of fluorinated gases. Alternative cooling systems, such as passive cooling building design and passive daytime radiative cooling surfaces, can reduce air conditioning use. Suburbs and cities in hot and arid climates can significantly reduce energy consumption from cooling with daytime radiative cooling. 193. Energy consumption for cooling is likely to rise significantly due to increasing heat and availability of devices in poorer countries. Of the 2.8 billion people living in the hottest parts of the world, only 8% currently have air conditioners, compared with 90% of people in the US and Japan. 194. Adoption of air conditioners typically increases in warmer areas at above $10,000 annual household income. 195. By combining energy efficiency improvements and decarbonizing electricity for air conditioning with the transition away from super-polluting refrigerants, the world could avoid cumulative greenhouse gas emissions of up to 210 to 460 GTCO2 EQ over the next 4 decades. 196. A shift to renewable energy in the cooling sector comes with 2 advantages. Solar energy production with midday peaks corresponds with the load required for cooling, and additionally, cooling has a large potential for load management in the electric grid. 196. Urban planning. Bicycles have almost no carbon footprint. 197. Cities emitted 28 GTCO2 EQ in 2020 of combined CO2 and CH4 emissions. 89 TS61. This was from producing and consuming goods and services. 89 TS61. Climate smart urban planning aims to reduce sprawl to reduce the distance traveled. This lowers emissions from transportation. Switching from cars by improving walkability and cycling infrastructure is beneficial to a country's economy as a whole. 198. Urban forestry, lakes and other blue and green infrastructure can reduce emissions directly and indirectly by reducing energy demand for cooling. 89 TS66. Methane emissions from municipal solid waste can be reduced by segregation, composting, and recycling. 199. Transport. Sales of electric vehicles (EVs) indicate a trend away from gas-powered vehicles that generate greenhouse gases. Low-carbon freight transport and cycling are important components of transport decarbonization. 202. 203. Electric vehicles and environmentally friendly rail help to reduce the consumption of fossil fuels. In most cases, electric trains are more efficient than air transport and truck transport. 204. Other efficiency means include improved public transport, smart mobility, car sharing and electric hybrids. Fossil fuel for passenger cars can be included in emissions trading. 205. Furthermore, moving away from a car-dominated transport system towards low-carbon advanced public transport system is important. 206. Heavyweight, large personal vehicles, such as cars, require a lot of energy to move and take up much urban space. 207. 208. Several alternatives modes of transport are available to replace these. The European Union has made smart mobility part of its European Green Deal. 209. In smart cities, smart mobility is also important. 210. Battery electric bus in Montreal. The World Bank is helping lower-income countries buy electric buses. Their purchase price is higher than diesel buses, but lower running costs and health improvements due to cleaner air can offset this higher price. 211. Between 1/4 and 3/4 of cars on the road by 2050 are forecast to be electric vehicles. 212. Hydrogen may be a solution for long-distance heavy freight trucks, if batteries alone are too heavy. 213. Shipping. In the shipping industry, the use of liquefied natural gas (LNG) as a marine bunker fuel is driven by emissions regulations. Ship operators must switch from heavy fuel oil to more expensive oil-based fuels, implement costly flue gas treatment technologies, or switch to LNG engines. 214. Methane slip. When gas leaks unburned through the engine, lowers the advantages of LNG. Maersk, the world's biggest container shipping line and vessel operator, warns of stranded assets when investing in transitional fuels like LNG. 215. The company lists green ammonia as one of the preferred fuel types of the future. It has announced the first carbon-neutral vessel on the water by 2023, running on carbon-neutral methanol. 216. Cruise operators are trialing partially hydrogen-powered ships. 217. Hybrid and all-electric ferries are suitable for short distances. Norway's goal is an all-electric fleet by 2025. 218. Air transport. Between 1940 and 2018, aviation CO2 emissions grew from 0.7% to 2.65% of all CO2 emissions. 219. Jet airliners contribute to climate change by emitting carbon dioxide, nitrogen oxides, contrails and particulates. Their radiative forcing is estimated at 1.3–1.4 that of CO2 alone, excluding induced cirrus cloud. In 2018, global commercial operations generated 2.4% of all CO2 emissions. 220. The aviation industry has become more fuel efficient, but overall emissions have risen as the volume of air travel has increased. By 2020, aviation emissions were 70% higher than in 2005 and they could grow by 300% by 2050. 221. It is possible to reduce aviation's environmental footprint by better fuel economy in aircraft. Optimizing flight routes to lower non-CO2 effects on climate from nitrogen oxides, particulates or contrails can also help. Aviation biofuel, carbon emission trading and carbon offsetting, part of the 191-nation ICAO's Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, CORSIA, can lower CO2 emissions. Short-haul flight bans, train connections, personal choices and taxation on flights can lead to fewer flights. Hybrid electric aircraft and electric aircraft or hydrogen-powered aircraft may replace fossil fuel-powered aircraft. Experts expect emissions from aviation to rise in most projections, at least until 2040. They currently amount to 180 amount of CO2 or 11% of transport emissions. Aviation biofuel and hydrogen can only cover a small proportion of flights in the coming years. Experts expect hybrid-driven aircraft to start commercial regional scheduled flights after 2030. Battery-powered aircraft are likely to enter the market after 2035. 222. Under CORSIA, flight operators can purchase carbon offsets to cover their emissions above 2019 levels. CORSIA will be compulsory from 2027. Agriculture, forestry and land use. Greenhouse gas emissions across the supply chain for different foods, showing which type of food should be encouraged and which discouraged from a mitigation perspective. Almost 20% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the agriculture and forestry sector. 223. To significantly reduce these emissions, annual investments in the agriculture sector need to increase to $260 billion by 2030. The potential benefits from these investments are estimated at about $4.3 trillion by 2030, offering a substantial economic return of 16 to 1. 224. 7-8. Mitigation measures in the food system can be divided into 4 categories. These are demand-side changes, ecosystem protections, mitigation on farms, and mitigation in supply chains. On the demand side, limiting food waste is an effective way to reduce food emissions. Changes to a diet less reliant on animal products such as plant-based diets are also effective. 1025. With 21% of global methane emissions, cattle are a major driver of global warming. 225. 6. When rainforests are cut and the land is converted for grazing, the impact is even higher. In Brazil, producing 1 kilogram of beef can result in the emission of up to 335 kilograms CO2 eq. 226. Other livestock, manure management and rice cultivation also emit greenhouse gases, in addition to fossil fuel combustion in agriculture. Important mitigation options for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from livestock include genetic selection, 227, 228, introduction of methanotrophic bacteria into the rumen, 229, 230, vaccines, feeds, 231, diet modification and grazing management. 232, 233, 234, other options are diet changes towards ruminant-free alternatives, such as milk substitutes and meat analogs. Non-ruminant livestock, such as poultry, emit far fewer GHGs. 235. It is possible to cut methane emissions in rice cultivation by improved water management, combining dry seeding in one drawdown, or executing a sequence of wetting and drying. This results in emission reductions of up to 90% compared to full flooding and even increased yields. 236. Industry. Global carbon dioxide emissions by country in 2023. China 31.8%. United States 14.4%, European Union 4.9%, India 9.5%. Russia 5.8%, Japan 3.5%. Other 30.1%. Industry is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases when direct and indirect emissions are included. Electrification can reduce emissions from industry. Green hydrogen can play a major role in energy-intensive industries for which electricity is not an option. Further mitigation options involve the steel and cement industry, which can switch to a less polluting production process. Products can be made with less material to reduce emission intensity and industrial processes can be made more efficient. Finally, circular economy measures reduce the need for new materials. This also saves on emissions that would have been released from the mining of collecting of those materials. 1043. The decarbonization of cement production requires new technologies, and therefore investment in innovation. 237. Bioconcrete is one possibility to reduce emissions. 238. But no technology for mitigation is yet mature. CCS will be necessary at least in the short term. 239. Another sector with a significant carbon footprint is the steel sector, which is responsible for about 7% of global emissions. 240. Emissions can be reduced by using electric arc furnaces to melt and recycle scrap steel. To produce virgin steel without emissions, blast furnaces could be replaced by hydrogen direct reduced iron and electric arc furnaces. Alternatively, carbon capture and storage solutions can be used. 240. Coal, gas and oil production often come with significant methane leakage. 241. In the early 2020s some governments recognized the scale of the problem and introduced regulations. 242. Methane leaks at oil and gas wells and processing plants are cost-effective to fix in countries which can easily trade gas internationally. 241. There are leaks in countries where gas is cheap, such as Iran. 243. Russia. 244. And Turkmenistan. 245. Nearly all this can be stopped by replacing old components and preventing routine flaring. 241. Coalbed methane may continue leaking even after the mine has been closed. but it can be captured by drainage and/or ventilation systems. 246 Fossil fuel firms do not always have financial incentives to tackle methane leakage. 247. Co-benefits. Co-benefits of climate change mitigation, also often referred to as ancillary benefits, were firstly dominated in the scientific literature by studies that describe how lower GHG emissions lead to better air quality and consequently impact human health positively. 249 The scope of co-benefits research expanded to its economic, social, ecological and political implications. Positive secondary effects that occur from climate mitigation and adaptation measures have been mentioned in research since the 1990s. 251 The IPCC first mentioned the role of co-benefits in 2001, followed by its fourth and fifth assessment cycle stressing improved working environment, reduced waste, health benefits and reduced capital expenditures. 252 In the early 2000s the OECD was further fostering its efforts in promoting ancillary benefits. 253 The IPCC pointed out in 2007, co-benefits of GHG mitigation can be an important decision criteria in analyses carried out by policymakers, but they are often neglected, and added that the co-benefits are not quantified, monetized or even identified by businesses and decision makers. 254 Appropriate consideration of co-benefits can greatly influence policy decisions concerning the timing and level of mitigation action, and there can be significant advantages to the national economy and technical innovation. 254 An analysis of climate action in the UK found that public health benefits are a major component of the total benefits derived from climate action. 255 Employment and economic development. Co-benefits can positively impact employment, industrial development, states' energy independence and energy self-consumption. The deployment of renewable energies can foster job opportunities. Depending on the country and deployment scenario, replacing coal power plants with renewable energy can more than double the number of jobs per average MW capacity. 256 Investments in renewable energies, especially in solar and wind energy, can boost the value of production. 257 Countries which rely on energy imports can enhance their energy independence and ensure supply security by deploying renewables. National energy generation from renewables lowers the demand for fossil fuel imports, which scales up annual economic saving. 258 The European Commission forecasts a shortage of 180,000 skilled workers in hydrogen production and 66,000 in solar photovoltaic power by 2030. 259 Energy security. A higher share of renewables can additionally lead to more energy security. 260 Socioeconomic co-benefits have been analyzed, such as energy access in rural areas and improved rural livelihoods. 262 Rural areas which are not fully electrified can benefit from the deployment of renewable energies. Solar-powered mini-grids can remain economically viable, cost-competitive and reduce the number of power cuts. Energy reliability has additional social implications. Stable electricity improves the quality of education. 263 The International Energy Agency (IEA) spelled out the multiple benefits approach of energy efficiency, while the International Renewable Energy Agency (IRENA) operationalized the list of co-benefits of the renewable energy sector. 265 Health and well-being. The health benefits from climate change mitigation are significant. Potential measures can not only mitigate future health impacts from climate change but also improve health directly. 267 Climate change mitigation is interconnected with various health benefits, such as those from reduced air pollution. 267 Air pollution generated by fossil fuel combustion is both a major driver of global warming and the cause of a large number of annual deaths. Some estimates are as high as 8.7 million excess deaths during 2018. 269 A 2023 study estimated that fossil fuels kill over 5 million people each year, as of 2019, 270 by causing diseases such as heart attack, stroke and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. 271 Particulate air pollution kills by far the most, followed by ground-level ozone. 272 Mitigation policies can also promote healthier diets such as less red meat, more active lifestyles, and increased exposure to green urban spaces. 274 Access to urban green spaces provides benefits to mental health as well. 218 The increased use of green and blue infrastructure can reduce the urban heat island effect. This reduces heat stress on people. 89 TS 66 Climate change adaptation. Some mitigation measures have co-benefits in the area of climate change adaptation. 275 8 to 63 This is for example the case for many nature-based solutions. 276 4 to 94 277 6 examples in the urban context include urban green and blue infrastructure which provide mitigation as well as adaptation benefits. This can be in the form of urban forests and street trees, green roofs and walls, urban agriculture and so forth. The mitigation is achieved through the conservation and expansion of carbon sinks and reduced energy use of buildings. Adaptation benefits come for example through reduced heat stress and flooding risk. 275 8 to 64 Emission trading and carbon taxes around the world 2019 278 Carbon emission trading implemented or scheduled. Negative side effects. Mitigation measures can also have negative side effects and risks. 89 TS 133 In agriculture and forestry, mitigation measures can affect biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. 89 TS 87 In renewable energy, mining for metals and minerals can increase threats to conservation areas. 279 There is some research into ways to recycle solar panels and electronic waste. This would create a source for materials so there is no need to mine them. 281 Scholars have found that discussions about risks and negative side effects of mitigation measures can lead to deadlock or the feeling that there are insuperable barriers to taking action. 281. Costs and funding. Several factors affect mitigation cost estimates. One is the baseline. This is a reference scenario that the alternative mitigation scenario is compared with. Others are the way costs are modeled, and assumptions about future government policy. 282. 622 Cost estimates for mitigation for specific regions depend on the quantity of emissions allowed for that region in future, as well as the timing of interventions. 282. 622 Cost estimates for mitigation for specific regions depend on the quantity of emissions allowed for that region in future, as well as the timing of interventions. 283. 90. Mitigation costs will vary according to how and when emissions are cut. Early, well-planned action will minimize the costs. 142. Globally, the benefits of keeping warming under 2 degrees Celsius exceed the costs. 284, which according to The Economist are affordable. 285. Economists estimate the cost of climate change mitigation at between 1% and 2% of GDP. 286. 287. While this is a large sum, it is still far less than the subsidies governments provide to the ailing fossil fuel industry. The International Monetary Fund estimated this at more than $5 trillion per year. 288. 40. Another estimate says that financial flows for climate mitigation and adaptation are going to be over $800 billion per year. These financial requirements are predicted to exceed $4 trillion per year by 2030. 289. 290. Globally, limiting warming to 2 degrees Celsius may result in higher economic benefits than economic costs. 291. 300. The economic repercussions of mitigation vary widely across regions and households, depending on policy design and level of international cooperation. Delayed global cooperation increases policy costs across regions, especially in those that are relatively carbon-intensive at present. Pathways with uniform carbon values show higher mitigation costs in more carbon-intensive regions, in fossil fuels exporting regions and in poorer regions. Aggregate quantifications expressed in GDP or monetary terms undervalue the economic effects on households in poorer countries. The actual effects on welfare and well-being are comparatively larger. 292. Cost-benefit analysis may be unsuitable for analyzing climate change mitigation as a whole. But it is still useful for analyzing the difference between a 1.5 degrees Celsius target and 2 degrees Celsius. 286. One way of estimating the cost of reducing emissions is by considering the likely costs of potential technological and output changes. Policymakers can compare the marginal abatement costs of different methods to assess the cost and amount of possible abatement over time. The marginal abatement costs of the various measures will differ by country, by sector, and over time. 142. Eco-tariffs on only imports contribute to reduced global export competitiveness and to deindustrialization. 293. Avoided costs of climate change effects. It is possible to avoid some of the costs of the effects of climate change by limiting climate change. According to the Stern Review, inaction can be as high as the equivalent of losing at least 5% of global gross domestic product (GDP) each year, now and forever. This can be up to 20% of GDP or more when including a wider range of risks and impacts. But mitigating climate change will only cost about 2% of GDP. Also, it may not be a good idea from a financial perspective to delay significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. 294. 295. Mitigation solutions are often evaluated in terms of costs and greenhouse gas reduction potentials. This fails to take into account the direct effects on human well-being. 296. Distributing emissions abatement costs. Mitigation at the speed and scale required to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius or below implies deep economic and structural changes. These raise multiple types of distributional concerns across regions, income classes and sectors. 292. There have been different proposals on how to allocate responsibility for cutting emissions. 297. 103. These include egalitarianism, basic needs according to a minimum level of consumption, proportionality and the polluter pays principle. A specific proposal is equal per capita entitlements. 297. 106. This approach has two categories. In the first category, emissions are allocated according to national population. In the second category, emissions are allocated in a way that attempts to account for historical or cumulative emissions. Funding. In order to reconcile economic development with mitigating carbon emissions, developing countries need particular support. This would be both financial and technical. The IPCC found that accelerated support would also tackle inequities in financial and economic vulnerability to climate change. 298. One way to achieve this is the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism, CDM. Policies. National policies. Although China is the leading producer of CO2 emissions in the world with the US second, per capita the US leads China by a fair margin, data from 2017. Climate change mitigation policies can have a large and complex impact on the socio-economic status of individuals and countries. This can be both positive and negative. 299. It is important to design policies well and make them inclusive. Otherwise, climate change mitigation measures can impose higher financial costs on poor households. 300. An evaluation was conducted on 1,500 climate policy interventions made between 1998 and 2022. 301. The interventions took place in 41 countries and across 6 continents, which together contributed 81% of the world's total emissions as of 2019. The evaluation found 63 successful interventions that resulted in significant emission reductions. The total CO2 release averted by these interventions was between 0.6 and 1.8 billion metric tons. The study focused on interventions with at least 4.5% emission reductions, but the researchers noted that meeting the reductions required by the Paris Agreement would require 23 billion metric tons per year. Generally, carbon pricing was found to be most effective in developed countries, while regulation was most effective in the developing countries. Complementary policy mixes benefited from synergies, and were mostly found to be more effective interventions than the implementation of isolated policies. 302, 303, 304. The OECD recognized 48 distinct climate mitigation policies suitable for implementation at national level. Broadly, these can be categorized into three types: market-based instruments, non-market-based instruments and other policies. 305, 301. Other policies include the establishing an independent climate advisory body. 305. Non-market-based policies include the implementing or tightening of regulatory standards. These set technology or performance standards. They can be effective in addressing the market failure of informational barriers. 306, 412. Among market-based policies, the carbon price has been found to be the most effective, at least for developed economies, 301, and has its own section below. Additional market-based policy instruments for climate change mitigation include emissions taxes. These often require domestic emitters to pay a fixed fee or tax for every ton of CO2 emissions they release into the atmosphere. 306, 4123. Methane emissions from fossil fuel extraction are also occasionally taxed. 307, but methane and nitrous oxide from agriculture are typically not subject to tax. 308. Removing unhelpful subsidies. Many countries provide subsidies for activities that affect emissions. For example, significant fossil fuel subsidies are present in many countries. 309. Phasing out fossil fuel subsidies is crucial to address the climate crisis. 310. It must however be done carefully to avoid protests. 311. And making poor people poorer. 312. Creating helpful subsidies. Creating subsidies and financial incentives. 313. One example is energy subsidies to support clean generation which is not yet commercially viable, such as tidal power. 314. Tradable permits. A permit system can limit emissions. 306, 415. Carbon pricing. Carbon emission trade. Allowance prices from 2008. Imposing additional costs on greenhouse gas emissions can make fossil fuels less competitive and accelerate investments into low-carbon sources of energy. A growing number of countries raise a fixed carbon tax or participate in dynamic carbon emission trading (ETS) systems. In 2021, more than 21% of global greenhouse gas emissions were covered by a carbon price. This was a big increase from earlier due to the introduction of the Chinese National Carbon Trading Scheme. 315, 23. Trading schemes offer the possibility to limit emission allowances to certain reduction targets. However, an oversupply of allowances keeps most ETS at low price levels around $10 with a low impact. This includes the Chinese ETS, which started with $7 per TCO2 in 2021. 316. One exception is the European Union Emission Trading Scheme, where prices began to rise in 2018. They reached about €80 per TCO2 in 2022. 317. This results in additional costs of about 4 cents per kilowatt-hour for. This includes the Chinese ETS, which started with $7 per TCO2 in 2021. 316. One exception is the European Union Emission Trading Scheme, where prices began to rise in 2018. They reached about €80 per TCO2 in 2022. 317. This results in additional costs of about 4 cents per kilowatt-hour for coal and 2 cents per kilowatt-hour for gas combustion for electricity, depending on the emission intensity. Industries which have high energy requirements and high emissions often pay only very low energy taxes, or even none at all. 318, 11-80. While this is often part of national schemes, carbon offsets and credits can be part of a voluntary market as well, such as on the international market. Notably, the company Blue Carbon of the UAE has bought ownership over an area equivalent to the United Kingdom to be preserved in return for carbon credits. 319. International agreements. Almost all countries are parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. 320, 321. The ultimate objective of the UNFCCC is to stabilize atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases at a level that would prevent dangerous human interference with the climate system. 322. Although not designed for this purpose, the Montreal Protocol has benefited climate change mitigation efforts. 323. The Montreal Protocol is an international treaty that has successfully reduced emissions of ozone-depleting substances such as CFCs. These are also greenhouse gases. Paris Agreement. Signatories yellow and parties blue to the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, also called the Paris Accords or Paris Climate Accords, is an international treaty on climate change that was signed in 2016. 324. The treaty covers climate change mitigation, adaptation, and finance. The Paris Agreement was negotiated by 196 parties at the 2015 United Nations Climate Change Conference near Paris, France. As of February 2023, 195 members of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, are parties to the agreement. Of the 3 UNFCCC member states which have not ratified the agreement, the only major emitter is Iran. The United States withdrew from the agreement in 2020, 325, but rejoined in 2021. 326. History. Historically, efforts to deal with climate change have taken place at a multinational level. They involve attempts to reach a consensus decision at the United Nations, under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. 327. This is the dominant approach historically of engaging as many international governments as possible in taking action on a worldwide public issue. The Montreal Protocol in 1987 is a precedent that this approach can work. But some critics say the top-down framework of only utilizing the UNFCCC consensus approach is ineffective. They put forward counter-proposals of bottom-up governance. At this same time, this would lessen the emphasis on the UNFCCC. 328, 329, 330. The Kyoto Protocol to the UNFCCC adopted in 1997 set out legally binding emission reduction commitments for the Annex 1 countries. 331, 817. The protocol defined 3 international policy instruments, flexibility mechanisms, which could be used by the Annex 1 countries to meet their emission reduction commitments. According to Bashmakov, use of these instruments could significantly reduce the costs for Annex 1 countries in meeting their emission reduction commitments. 332, 402. The Paris Agreement reached in 2015 succeeded the Kyoto Protocol, which expired in 2020. Countries that ratified the Kyoto Protocol committed to reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide and 5 other greenhouse gases, or engage in carbon emissions trading if they maintain or increase emissions of these gases. In 2015, the UNFCCC's Structured Expert Dialogue came to the conclusion that, in some regions and vulnerable ecosystems, high risks are projected even for warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius. 333. Together with the strong diplomatic voice of the poorest countries and the island nations in the Pacific, this expert finding was the driving force leading to the decision of the 2015 Paris Climate Conference to lay down this 1.5 degrees Celsius long-term target on top of the existing 2 degrees Celsius goal. 334. Society and culture. Commitments to divest. More firms plan to invest in climate change mitigation, specifically focusing on low-carbon sectors. 335. More than 1,000 organizations with investments worth $8 trillion United States dollars have made commitments to fossil fuel divestment. 336. Socially responsible investing funds allow investors to invest in funds that meet high environmental, social and corporate governance (ESG) standards. 337. Barriers. A typology of discourses aimed at delaying climate change. Mitigation. 281. Distribution of committed CO2 emissions from developed fossil fuel reserves. Committed CO2 emissions from developed fossil fuel reserves. There are individual, institutional and market barriers to achieving climate change mitigation. 95 to 71. They differ for all the different mitigation options, regions and societies. Difficulties with accounting for carbon dioxide removal can act as economic barriers. This would apply to BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. 39, 6 to 42. The strategies that companies follow can act as a barrier. But they can also accelerate decarbonization. 95 to 84. In order to decarbonize societies, the state needs to play a predominant role. This is because it requires a massive coordination effort. 338, 213. This strong government role can only work well if there is social cohesion, political stability and trust. 338, 213. For land-based mitigation options, finance is a major barrier. Other barriers are cultural values, governance, accountability and institutional capacity. 118, 7 to 5. Developing countries face further barriers to mitigation. 339. The cost of capital increased in the early 2020s. 340. A lack of available capital and finance is common in developing countries. 341. Together with the absence of regulatory standards, this barrier supports the proliferation of inefficient equipment. There are also financial and capacity barrier in many of these countries. 97. One study estimates that only 0.12% of all funding for climate-related research goes on the social science of climate change mitigation. 342. Vastly more funding goes on natural science studies of climate change. Considerable sums also go on studies of the impact of climate change and adaptation to it. 342. Impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic led some governments to shift their focus away from climate action, at least temporarily. 343. This obstacle to environmental policy efforts may have contributed to slowed investment in green energy technologies. The economic slowdown resulting from COVID-19 added to this effect. 344, 345. In 2020, carbon dioxide emissions fell by 6.4% or 2.3 billion tons globally. 346. Greenhouse gas emissions rebounded later in the pandemic as many countries began lifting restrictions. The direct impact of pandemic policies had a negligible long-term impact on climate change. 346, 347. Greenhouse gas emissions per person in the highest emitting countries. 348. Though China has the greatest total annual carbon dioxide emissions, the US and a few other high-emitting countries exceed China in per capita emissions. Richer developed countries emit more CO2 per person than poorer developing countries. 349. Emissions are roughly proportional to GDP per person, though the rate of examples by country. Climate Change Portal. Plants Portal. Trees Portal. Increase diminishes with average GDP (PP) of about $10,000. United States. The United States government has held shifting attitudes toward addressing greenhouse gas emissions. The George W. Bush administration opted not to sign the Kyoto Protocol, 350, but the Obama administration entered the Paris Agreement. 351. The Trump administration withdrew from the Paris Agreement while increasing the export of crude oil and gas, making the United States the largest producer. 352. In 2021, the Biden administration committed to reducing emissions to half of 2005 levels by 2030. 353 In 2022, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law, which is estimated to provide around $375 billion over 10 years to fight climate change. 354 As of 2022, the social cost of carbon is $51 a ton, whereas academics say it should be more than 3 times higher. 355 China has committed to peak emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by 2060. 356 Warming cannot be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius if any coal plants in China without carbon capture operate after 2045. 357 The Chinese National Carbon Trading Scheme started in 2021. European Union. The European Commission estimates that an additional €477 million in annual investment is needed for the European Union to meet its Fit for 55 decarbonization goals. 359 In the European Union, government-driven policies in the European Green Deal have helped position green tech, as an example, as a vital area for venture capital investment. By 2023, venture capital in the EU's green tech sector equaled that of the United States, reflecting a concerted effort to drive innovation and mitigate climate change through targeted financial support. 361 The European Green Deal has fostered policies that contributed to a 30% rise in venture capital for green tech companies in the EU from 2021 to 2023, despite a downturn in other sectors during the same period. 362 While overall venture capital investment in the EU remains about 6 times lower than in the United States, the green tech sector has closed this gap significantly, attracting substantial funding. Key areas benefiting from increased investments are energy storage, circular economy initiatives, and agricultural technology. This is supported by the EU's ambitious goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030. 362 Relationship with solar radiation modification, SRM. While solar radiation modification, SRM, could reduce surface temperatures, it temporarily masks climate change rather than addressing the root cause, which is greenhouse gases. 363 14 to 56 SRM would work by altering how much solar radiation the Earth absorbs. 363 14 to 56 examples include reducing the amount of sunlight reaching the surface, reducing the optical thickness and lifetime of clouds, and changing the ability of the surface to reflect radiation. 364 The IPCC describes SRM as a climate risk reduction strategy or supplementary option rather than a climate mitigation option. 363 The terminology in this area is still evolving. Experts sometimes use the term geoengineering or climate engineering in the scientific literature for both CDR or SRM, if the techniques are used at a global scale. 12.6-11 IPCC reports no longer use the terms geoengineering or climate engineering. Deem biology. In biology, a deem, in the strict sense, is a group of individuals that belong to the same taxonomic group. 1. However, when biologists, and especially ecologists, use the term deem, they usually refer to it as the definition of a gamodeem. 2. A local group of individuals from the same taxon that interbreed with each other and share a gene pool. 1. The latter definition of a deem is only applicable to sexual reproducing species, while the former is more neutral and also takes asexual reproducing species into account, such as certain plant species. In the following sections the latter, and most frequently used, definition of a deem will be used. In evolutionary computation, a deem often refers to any isolated subpopulation subjected to selection as a unit rather than as individuals. 5. Rapid speciation is explained by the ecology and social structure of deems. Species that behave more territorial, live in patchy environments and/or have a polygyny. Deem biology. In biology, a deem, in the strict sense, is a group of individuals that belong to the same taxonomic group. 1. However, when biologists, and especially ecologists, use the term deem, they usually refer to it as the definition of a gamodeem. 2. A local group of individuals from the same taxon that interbreed with each other and share a gene pool. 1. The latter definition of a deem is only applicable to sexual reproducing species, while the former is more neutral and also takes asexual reproducing species into account, such as certain plant species. In the following sections the latter, and most frequently used, definition of a deem will be used. In evolutionary computation, a deem often refers to any isolated subpopulation subjected to selection as a unit rather than as individuals. Local adaptation. A population of a species usually has multiple deems. Environments between these deems can differ. Deems could, therefore, become locally adapted to their environment. A good example of this is the adaptive deem formation (ADF) hypothesis in insects. 3. The ADF hypothesis states that herbivorous insects can become adapted to specific host plants in their local environment because local plants can have unique nutrient patches to which insects may become adapted. This hypothesis predicts that less mobile insect deems are more likely to become locally adapted than more dispersive insect. However, a meta-analysis, based on 17 studies on this subject, showed that dispersive insect deems were as likely to become locally adapted as less mobile insects. 3. Moreover, this study found a small indication that feeding behavior might stimulate the local adaptation of deems. Endophagous insects were more likely to become locally adapted than exophagous insects. The explanation for this could be that endophagous insects come in more close and continuous contact to the plant's mechanical, chemical and phenological defensive mechanisms. 3. Speciation and deems. Speciation could occur at the level of deems. When a deem gets geographically isolated from other deems of the same species, gene flow between these deems will stop, which could lead to speciation after a long time. This is called allopatric speciation and is generally a slow process. 4. On the contrary, sympatric speciation can be more rapid when a species has multiple small deems. 5. This rapid speciation is both observed in plants, and vertebrates. 5. Rapid speciation is explained by the ecology and social structure of demes. Species that behave more territorial, live in patchy environments and/or have a polygynous breeding system with only one reproductive male tend to have smaller deme sizes. Interbreeding between small demes is rare due to these factors. Furthermore, alleles fixate more rapidly in smaller demes. Small demes could, therefore, become genetically distinct from each other. 5. Primates, for example, have the second highest speciation rate among mammals, with one speciation event per lineage every 3 million years. 5. However, not all primate species have a high speciation rate. This is reflected in their deme size and social structure. Guenons Cercopithecus, for example, live together in small polygynous troops and are a quite diverse genus. On the other hand, baboons Papio have a much lower speciation rate. Baboons have larger deme sizes because they live in polygynous multi-male troops. These baboon demes are usually allopatric, but gene flow still exists between demes, with hybridization being common. 5. Examples. Various populations of gorillas can be understood by their geographical separation and have been assessed to determine distinct and disjointed gene pools. 7. The polar bear, Ursus maritimus, is understood to have 19 identifiable demes, even though their circumpolar distribution allows some interchange among the demes. 8. See also. Realized niche width. Realized niche width is a phrase relating to ecology, is defined by the actual space that an organism inhabits and the resources it can access as a result of limiting pressures from other species, e.g. superior competitors. An organism's ecological niche is determined by the biotic and abiotic factors that make up that specific ecosystem that allow that specific organism to survive there. The width of an organism's niche is set by the range of conditions a species is able to survive in that specific environment. Definition. The fundamental niche width of an organism refers to the theoretical range of conditions that an organism could survive and reproduce in without considering interspecific interactions. The fundamental niche exclusively considers limiting biotic and abiotic factors such as appropriate food sources and a suitable climate. The niche width of an organism refers to the theoretical range of conditions that an organism could survive and reproduce in without considering interspecific interactions. The fundamental niche exclusively considers limiting biotic and abiotic factors such as appropriate food sources and a suitable climate. The fundamental niche width often differs from the realized niche width, the areas where actually inhabited by a given species. 1. This differentiation is due to interspecific competition with other species within their ecosystem while still considering the biotic and abiotic limiting factors. A species' realized niche is usually much narrower than its fundamental niche width as it is forced to adjust its niche around the superior competing species. The physical area where a species lives is its habitat. The set of environmental features essential to that species' survival is its niche. Ecology. Begin, Harper, Townsend. Importance. The difference between the realized and the fundamental niche is important in understanding how interactions with a variety of different species in one environment affects the fitness of another species. This is not only important in understanding how a species functions in an ecosystem, but it is also important in determining the potential and realized success of invasive species. Invasive species could thrive or be killed off in an environment where they would theoretically be able to exist based on the presence or lack of of different species. 2. To survive, an invasive species first has to successfully survive the journey to the new area. They then have to be able to survive in that habitat. After this, they then must be able to successfully compete and reproduce with the other species already in the new, invaded environment. Considering these factors, not all invasive species are devastating to the new environment they inhabit, as they must first overcome these other challenges before they can negatively affect their new environment. In an organism's niche, the abiotic and biotic factors determine the ability of a species to survive. However, both the abiotic and biotic factors of that environment can be changed by that species' existence. A species' impact on its biotic environment in its niche tend to affect not only that species' ability to survive, but the other species it coexists with. Again, these changes are important in understanding the effects of invasive species in a new habitat. The ability of a new species to change an environment's abiotic and biotic factors can make a previously habitable environment for a species uninhabitable. The extinction of this species can further change the biotic factors of an environment. Invasive species not only directly affect the biotic environment, but they indirectly affect this environment by affecting the species able to survive in this habitat. Niche theory states that a species' ranges are limited by their physiological tolerances, fundamental niche, and their biotic limitations, realized niche. The survival rates of organisms facing rapid niche shifts help scientists predict the future effects of climate change and invasive species on current ecological communities. The ability of organisms to shift niches also helps scientists understand community formation and speciation. Niche shifts for invasive species in their native environment differ from those in their newly invaded environment. After an invasive species is introduced to their new environment, they have to cope with new biotic factors, environmental constraints, and climate differences. These variables play a role in determining how the organism's niche will evolve. Biophysical models use links between an organism's preferred climate and their functional traits to determine where an organism could survive without taking biotic factors into account. 3. Experiments. Barnacles. The phenomenon of fundamental and realized niches was documented by the ecologist Joseph Connell in his study of species overlap between barnacles on intertidal rocks. He observed that Stomalus stellatus and Balanus balanoides inhabited the upper and lower strata of intertidal rocks respectively, but only Stomalus barnacles could survive both the upper and lower strata without desiccation. The removal of Balanus barnacles from the lower strata resulted in the Stomalus barnacles occupying its fundamental niche, both upper and lower strata, which is much larger than its realized niche in the upper strata. 4. This experiment was conducted on the rocky intertidal because of its accessibility and the large amount of previous research done on the species living there. Many of the species that live here are also sedentary or slow-moving, making them easier to study. The different species are also more easily manipulated, creating experimental and control groups that can be better studied because of their sedentary or slow-moving state. The goal of Connell's experiment was to determine how much physical and biotic competition factors affected community structure in the rocky intertidal ecosystem. Vertical zonation also plays a role in determining the placement of different species in the rocky intertidal ecosystem, which was previously thought to be due to the tides. 5. Invasion biology. A study by Tingley et al. Focuses on the invasion of the cane toad, Rhinella marina, formerly Bufo marinus, of Australia. Through thermal acclimation and development of improved movement functions, this toad has expanded its habitat range significantly. Evidence in this study showed that there was a difference between the toad's native niche and its invaded environment niche. A review of 180 case studies showed only 50% of invasive species went through a niche shift. However, niche changes are determined in a variety of different ways, making it hard to determine how accurate this study is. It was also proven that the toad's increased range was only observed in Australia and not in its native environment, even though the same physical conditions were present in both. This means that biotic factors and/or dispersal barriers limit the toad in its native environment. Without these constraints in its invaded environment, the toad is able to fill out its fundamental niche. Determining realized niches help with developing biotic control agents for invasive species, and determining an organism's fundamental niche helps scientists conclude how well a species would be able to survive and adapt to climate change. 3. Pathogens. Another study by Trong et al. Reviewed the use of plants as the realized niche for the human pathogen Listeria monocytogenes. This paper focuses on how this pathogen uses a plant as its realized niche. The fundamental niche of this pathogen can be determined through studies where the pathogen is grown aseptically, without other pathogens. However, abiotic and biotic factors limit the ability for this pathogen to exist in nature. This study was not able to clearly determine how this pathogen and plants survive together. However, it was shown that the plants did not defend itself against the presence of this pathogen. This study did support the theory that this pathogen can use plant nutrients to survive and multiply if the plant's environment and competition allows. However, more comprehensive research will need to be conducted to determine this pathogen's realized niche. This study further shows how determining an organism's realized niche can help understand this human pathogen's natural history. 6. Realized niche width is a phrase relating to ecology, is defined by the actual space that an organism inhabits and the resources it can access as a result of limiting pressures from other species, e.g. superior competitors. An organism's ecological niche is determined by the biotic and abiotic factors that make up that specific ecosystem that allow that specific organism to survive there. The width of an organism's niche is set by the range of conditions a species is able to survive in that specific environment. Definition. The fundamental niche width of an organism refers to the theoretical range of conditions that an organism could survive and reproduce in without considering interspecific interactions. The fundamental niche exclusively considers limiting biotic and abiotic factors such as appropriate food sources and a suitable climate. The fundamental niche width often differs from the realized niche width, the areas where actually inhabited by a given species. 1. This differentiation is due to interspecific competition with other species within their ecosystem while still considering the biotic and abiotic limiting factors. A species' realized niche is usually much narrower than its fundamental niche width as it is forced to adjust its niche around the superior competing species. The physical area where a species lives is its habitat. The set of environmental features essential to that species' survival is its niche. Ecology. Began, Harper, Townsend. Importance. The difference between the realized and the fundamental niche is important in understanding how interactions with a variety of different species in one environment affects the fitness of another species. This is not only important in understanding how a species functions in an ecosystem, but it is also important in determining the potential and realized success of invasive species. Invasive species could thrive or be killed off in an environment where they would theoretically be able to exist based on the presence or lack of thereof different species. 2. To survive, an invasive species first has to successfully survive the journey to the new area, they then have to be able to survive in that habitat. After this, they then must be able to successfully compete and reproduce with the other species already in the new, invaded environment. Considering these factors, not all invasive species are devastating to the new environment they inhabit as they must first overcome these other challenges before they can negatively affect their new environment. In an organism's niche, the abiotic and biotic factors determine the ability of a species to survive. However, both the abiotic and biotic factors of that environment can be changed by that species' existence. A species' impact on its biotic environment in its niche tend to affect not only that species' ability to survive, but the other species it coexists with. Again, these changes are important in understanding the effects of invasive species in a new habitat. The ability of a new species to change an environment's abiotic and biotic factors can make a previously habitable environment for a species uninhabitable. The extinction of this species can further change the biotic factors of an environment. Invasive species not only directly affect the biotic environment, but they indirectly affect this environment by affecting the species able to survive in this habitat. Niche theory states that a species' ranges are limited by their physiological tolerances, fundamental niche, and their biotic limitations, realized niche. The survival rates of organisms facing rapid niche shifts help scientists predict the future effects of climate change and invasive species on current ecological communities. The ability of organisms to shift niches also helps scientists understand community formation and speciation. Niche shifts for invasive species in their native environment differ from those in their newly invaded environment. After an invasive species is introduced to their new environment, they have to cope with new biotic factors, environmental constraints, and climate differences. These variables play a role in determining how the organism's niche will evolve. Biophysical models use links between an organism's preferred climate and their functional traits to determine where an organism could survive without taking biotic factors into account. 3. Experiments. Barnacles. The phenomenon of fundamental and realized niches was documented by the ecologist Joseph Connell in his study of species overlap between barnacles on intertidal rocks. He observed that Stomalus stellatus and Balanus balanoides inhabited the upper and lower strata of intertidal rocks respectively, but only Stomalus barnacles could survive both the upper and lower strata without desiccation. The removal of Balanus barnacles from the lower strata resulted in the Stomalus barnacles occupying its fundamental niche, both upper and lower strata, which is much larger than its realized niche in the upper strata. 4. This experiment was conducted on the rocky intertidal because of its accessibility and the large amount of previous research done on the species living there. Many of the species that live here are also sedentary or slow-moving, making them easier to study. The different species are also more easily manipulated, creating experimental and control groups that can be better studied because of their sedentary or slow-moving state. The goal of Connell's experiment was to determine how much physical and biotic competition factors affected community structure in the rocky intertidal ecosystem. Vertical zonation also plays a role in determining the placement of different species in the rocky intertidal ecosystem, which was previously thought to be due to the tides. 5. Invasion biology. A study by Tingley et al. Focuses on the invasion of the cane toad, Rhinella marina, formerly Bufo marinus, of Australia. Through thermal acclimation and development of improved movement functions, this toad has expanded its habitat range significantly. Evidence in this study showed that there was a difference between the toad's native niche and its invaded environment niche. A review of 180 case studies showed only 50% of invasive species went through a niche shift. However, niche changes are determined in a variety of different ways, making it hard to determine how accurate this study is. It was also proven that the toad's increased range was only observed in Australia and not in its native environment, even though the same physical conditions were present in both. This means that biotic factors and/or dispersal barriers limit the toad in its native environment. Without these constraints in its invaded environment, the toad is able to fill out its fundamental niche. Determining realized niches help with developing biotic control agents for invasive species, and determining an organism's fundamental niche helps scientists conclude how well a species would be able to survive and adapt to climate change. 3. Pathogens. Another study by Trong et al. Reviewed the use of plants as the realized niche for the human pathogen Listeria monocytogenes. This paper focuses on how this pathogen uses a plant as its realized niche. The fundamental niche of this pathogen can be determined through studies where the pathogen is grown aseptically, without other pathogens. However, abiotic and biotic factors limit the ability for this pathogen to exist in nature. This study was not able to clearly determine how this pathogen and plants survive together. However, it was shown that the plants did not defend itself against the presence of this pathogen. This study did support the theory that this pathogen can use plant nutrients to survive and multiply if the plant's environment and competition allows. However, more comprehensive research will need to be conducted to determine this pathogen's realized niche. This study further shows how determining an organism's realized niche can help understand this human pathogen's natural history. 6. Character displacement. Character displacement is a phenomenon where differences among similar species whose distributions overlap geographically are accentuated in regions where the species co-occur, but are minimized or lost where the species distributions do not overlap. This pattern results from evolutionary change driven by biological competition among species for a limited resource, e.g. food. The rationale for character displacement stems from the competitive exclusion principle, also called Gauss's law, which contends that to coexist in a stable environment two competing species must differ in their respective ecological niche. Without differentiation, one species will eliminate or exclude the other through competition. Character displacement occurs when similar species that live in the same geographical region and occupy similar niches differentiate in order to minimize niche overlap and avoid competitive exclusion. Several species of Galapagos finches display character displacement. Each closely related species differs in beak size and beak depth, allowing them to coexist in the same region since each species eats a different type of seed, the seed best fit for its unique beak. The finches with the deeper, stronger beaks consume large, tough seeds, while the finches with smaller beaks consume the smaller, softer seeds. Character displacement was first explicitly explained by William L. Brown Jr. and E.O. Wilson in 1956. Two closely related species have overlapping ranges. 1. In the parts of the ranges where one species occurs alone, the populations of that species are similar to the other species and may even be very difficult to distinguish from it. In the area of overlap, where the two species occur together, the populations are more divergent and easily distinguished, i.e., they displace one another in one or more characters. The characters involved can be morphological, ecological, behavioral, or physiological. They are assumed to be genetically based. Brown and Wilson use the term character displacement to refer to instances of both reproductive character displacement, or reinforcement of reproductive barriers, and ecological character displacement driven by competition. 1. As the term character displacement is commonly used, it generally refers to morphological differences due to competition. Brown and Wilson viewed character displacement as a phenomenon involved in speciation, stating, "We believe that it is a common aspect of geographical speciation, arising most often as a product of the genetic and ecological interaction of two or more newly evolved, cognate species derived from the same immediate parental species during their period of first contact." 1. While character displacement is important in various scenarios of speciation, 2. Including adaptive radiations like the cichlid fish faunas in the rift lakes of East Africa, 3. It also plays an important role in structuring communities. It also plays a role in speciation by reinforcement in such that allopatric populations overlapping in symmetry exhibit greater trait divergence. 4. The results of numerous studies contribute evidence that character displacement often influences the evolution of resource acquisition among members of an ecological guild. 5. Competitive release, defined as the expansion of an ecological niche in the absence of a competitor, is essentially the mirror image of character displacement. 6. It too was described by Brown and Wilson. Two closely related species are distinct where they occur together, but where one member of the pair occurs alone it converges toward the second, even to the extent of being nearly identical with it in some characters. 1. Conceptual development. Character displacement is the situation in which, when two species of animals overlap geographically, the differences between them are accentuated in the zone of sympatry and weakened or lost entirely in the parts of their ranges outside this zone. 1. While the term, ecological character displacement, first appeared in the scientific literature in 1956, the idea has earlier roots. For example, Joseph Grinnell, in the classic paper that set forth the concept of the ecological niche, stated, "It is, of course, axiomatic that no two species regularly established in a single fauna have precisely the same niche requirements." 7. The existence of character displacement is evidence that the two species do not completely overlap in their niche requirement. Following the dissemination of the concept, character displacement was viewed as an important force in structuring ecological communities, and biologists identified numerous examples. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, however, the role of competition and character displacement in structuring communities was questioned and its importance greatly downgraded. 8. Many found the early examples unconvincing and suggested it to be a rare phenomenon. Criticisms with earlier studies included the lack of rigor in statistical analyses and the use of poorly rationalized characters. 5. 8. Additionally, theories seem to indicate that the conditions that allowed character displacement to occur were limited. 8. This scrutiny helped motivate theoretical and methodological advances as well as the development of a more rigorous framework for testing character displacement. 8. 6 criteria have been developed to establish character displacement as the mechanism for differences between sympatric species. 9. 10. These include 1. Differences between sympatric taxa are greater than expected by chance. 2. Differences in character states are related to differences in resource use. 3. Resources are limiting, and interspecific competition for these resources is a function of character similarity. 4. Resource distribution are the same in sympatry and allopatry such that differences in character states are not due to differences in resource availability. 5. Differences must have evolved in situ. 6. Differences must be genetically based. 9. Rigorously testing these criteria necessitates a synthetic approach, combining areas of research like community ecology, functional morphology, adaptation, quantitative genetics and phylogenetic systematics. 5. While satisfying all 6 criteria in a single study of character displacement is not often feasible, they provide the necessary context for researching character displacement. 9. Rigorously testing these criteria necessitates a synthetic approach, combining areas of research like community ecology, functional morphology, adaptation, quantitative genetics and phylogenetic systematics. 5. While satisfying all 6 criteria in a single study of character displacement is not often feasible, they provide the necessary context for researching character displacement. 5. 8. Character displacement has indicated to be a major factor in beak size among finches located in the Galapagos Islands and Hawaiian Islands. 11. Examples. Studies have been performed in a wide variety of taxa, a few groups having disproportionately contributed to the understanding of character displacement: mammalian carnivores, Galapagos finches, anole lizards on islands, three-spined stickleback fish, and snails. 5. Birds. In the initial explication of character displacement, many of the examples set forth as potential evidence for character displacement were observations between multiple pairs of birds. These included rock nuthatches in Asia, Australian honeyeaters of the genus Misantha, Australian parrots, shearwaters in the Cape Verde Islands, flycatchers of the Bismarck Archipelago and notably, Darwin's finches in the Galapagos. 1. David Lack found that when the two species Geospiza fortis and G. fuliginosa occurred on large islands together, they could be distinguished unequivocally by beak size. 12. When either one occurred by itself on a smaller island, however, the beak size was intermediate in size relative to when the two co-occurred. 12. Similarly, Peter and Rosemary Grant found that a Geospiza fortis island population diverged in beak size due to high mortality from competitor G. magnirostris in a year with low food supply, apparently due to increased competition for larger seeds that both species fed on. 13. Most character displacement studies focus on morphological differences in feeding apparatus rather than on those relating to habitat use. However, comparisons of microhabitat use and morphological adaptations of western and eastern rock nuthatches indicate that these two species show spatial niche segregation in addition to trophic niche segregation. 14. It is often assumed that closely related species are more likely to compete than are more distantly related species, and hence many researchers investigate character displacement among species in the same genus. 5. While character displacement was originally discussed in the context of very closely related species, evidence suggests that even interactions among distantly related species can result in character displacement. Finches and bees in the Galapagos provide support for this. 15. Two finch species, Geospiza fuliginosa and G. difficilis, exploit more flower nectar on islands where the logger carpenter bee, Xylocopa darwini, is absent than on islands with the bees. Individual finches that harvest nectar are smaller than members of the same species that do not. 15. In a coexistence study of 4 finches such as the ground finch Geospiza spp, the tree finch Camarhynchus spp, the vegetarian finch Platyspiza crassirostris, and the warbler finch Certhedia spp, showed when competition is initially low, species might coexist even without character displacement. 16. 17. Many studies have measured niche, often seen in diet, overlap between closely related species, sometimes finding strong niche divergence, seen even in broad niche overlaps. The specific periods of diet divergence are seen as the main cause of adaptive divergence in morphology and performance of a bird species, which can be connected to periods of scarcity. 18. Between the sets of finches there were low competition. These results are due to correlation between the vast differences in diet coupled with large and adaptive differences in beak morphology. However, with similar levels of finch phylogeny showed ongoing divergence, diet overlap and competition. Reptiles. The lizard genus Anolis on the islands in the Caribbean has also been the subject of numerous studies investigating the role of competition and character displacement in community structure. 19. Lesser Antilles Islands can only support Anolis species of different sizes, and the relative importance of character displacement versus size at colonization in determining invasion success has been explored and debated. Amphibians. The Appalachian salamanders Plethodon hoffmanni and P. cinereus display no morphological differences, eating habits, or resource use exploitation differences among allopatric populations. When the species occurs in symmetry, however, they exhibit morphological differentiation that is associated with segregation in prey size. 20. Where these two species co-occur, P. hoffmanni has a faster closing jaw required for larger prey, and P. cinereus has a slower, stronger jaw for smaller prey. Other studies have found Plethodon salamander species that demonstrate character displacement from aggressive behavioral interference rather than exploitation. 21. That is, morphological character displacement between the two species is due to aggressive interaction between them rather than the exploitation of different food resources. Mollusks. On Okinawa Island, the snail species Satsuma largalierte lives on the eastern half of the island, while Satsuma eucosmia lives on the western half. Both populations overlap in symmetry along the middle of the island, where the penis length of the species differs significantly where they meet in symmetry. 22. The snail's penis lengths exhibit divergence, suggesting reproductive character displacement of this trait. 23. Fish. Three-spined sticklebacks Gastrosteus spp. In post-glacial lakes in western Canada have contributed significantly to recent research of character displacement. 24. 25. Both observations of natural populations and manipulative experiments show that when two recently evolved species occur in a single lake, two morphologies are selected for, a limnetic form that feeds in open water and a benthic form that feeds at the lake bottom. They differ in size, shape and the number and length of gill rakers, all of which is related to divergence in their diet. Hybrids between the two forms are selected against. When only one species inhabits a lake, that fish displays an intermediate morphology. Studies on other fish species have shown similar patterns of selection for benthic and limnetic morphologies, 5 which can also lead to sympatric speciation. 26. Mammals. Introduced species have also provided recent, natural experiments to investigate how rapidly character displacement can affect evolutionary change. 5. When American mink Mustela visone were introduced in northeastern Belarus, the native European mink Mustela lutriola increased in size, and the introduced mink decreased in size. 27. This displacement was observed within a 10-year study, demonstrating that competition can drive rapid evolutionary change. See also. Evidence for speciation by reinforcement niche segregation. Ecological speciation. Ecological speciation is a form of speciation arising from reproductive isolation that occurs due to an ecological factor that reduces or eliminates gene flow between two populations of a species. Ecological factors can include changes in the environmental conditions in which a species experiences, such as behavioral changes involving predation, predator avoidance, pollinator attraction, and foraging, as well as changes in mate choice due to sexual selection or communication systems. Ecologically driven reproductive isolation under divergent natural selection leads to the formation of new species. This has been documented in many cases in nature and has been a major focus of research on speciation for the past few decades. 179. Three-spined stickleback fish have been a frequently studied species in ecological speciation. Ecological speciation has been defined in various ways to identify it as distinct from known ecological forms of speciation. 2. The evolutionary biologist Dolph Schluter defines it as the evolution of reproductive isolation between populations or subsets of a single population by adaptation to different environments or ecological niches. 3. While others believe natural selection is the driving force. 4, 5, 6. The key difference between ecological speciation and other kinds of speciation is that it is triggered by divergent natural selection among different habitats, as opposed to other kinds of speciation processes like random genetic drift, the fixation of incompatible mutations in populations experiencing similar selective pressures, or various forms of sexual selection not involving selection on ecologically relevant traits. Ecological speciation can occur either in allopatry, sympatry, or parapatry, the only requirement being that speciation occurs as a result of adaptation to different ecological or microecological conditions. 6. Ecological speciation can occur prezygotically, barriers to reproduction that occur before the formation of a zygote, or postzygotically, barriers to reproduction that occur after the formation of a zygote. Examples of prezygotic isolation include habitat isolation, isolation via pollinator pollination systems, and temporal isolation. Examples of postzygotic isolation involve genetic incompatibilities of hybrids, low-fitness hybrids, and sexual selection against hybrids. Some debate exists over the framework concerning the delineation of whether a speciation event is ecological or non-ecological. The pervasive effect of selection suggests that adaptive evolution and speciation are inseparable, casting doubt on whether speciation is ever non-ecological. 2. However, there are numerous examples of closely related, ecologically similar species, e.g., Albunaria land snails on islands in the Mediterranean, 7. Batrachoceps salamanders from California, 8. And certain crickets, 9. And damselflies, 10. Which is a pattern consistent with the possibility of non-ecological speciation. 8. 11. Ecological causes of divergent selection. Divergent selection is key to the occurrence of ecological speciation. 3 ecological causes of divergent selection have been identified: differences in environmental conditions, ecological interactions, and sexual selection. The causes are outlined in the following list: 12.13.4. 2 types of experimental tests of ecological speciation caused by divergent environments. Experiment 1. A speciation event predicted to have occurred due to an ecologically based divergent factor giving rise to 2 new species. 1a.